All right, so we've talked about sensory memory, which has the capacity to hold everything our sensory neurons detect, but for a duration that's super short, on the order of a second or so. Then we've seen how short-term memory, or working memory, has a limited capacity to hold like a few chunks of information we're currently using for a duration of like 15 to 30 seconds. But what about holding information for more than 15 to 30 seconds? Holding information even when we're not currently using it or keeping it consciously in mind? That's the realm of long-term memory, which we're going to explore in these next few videos. And just like with our other memory systems, we might start by asking, what's the capacity or duration of long-term memory? And in both cases, we haven't really found a hard limit. Unlike a computer hard drive, we don't seem to ever run out of space, and there's no evidence that making new memories pushes out old ones to fit inside. That doesn't mean that our memory is infinite. We definitely have a finite and limited number of neurons up here in our brain, a lot of them, but a finite number. So there's got to be some upper limit, but it may be that limit is so high we would never experience enough things in a single lifetime to actually fill it up and run into a capacity issue per se. The harder issue is going to be retrieving the right memory from there when you want it and kind of hoping the memories stay accurate. Because frankly, when we say that we're storing a memory, it's not like storing a computer file that has a specific well-defined size and content. That's just not how memories work. Meanwhile, the duration of long-term memory is likewise not restricted by any clear upper bound that we've discovered, although the odds of retrieving memories can go down over time. But like a memory can last decades, so the duration is, we'll just say, very long relative to other forms of memory. Just to give a quick example, a study back in the 70s tested people for high school memories, like basically going back to old yearbooks and records, and found 90% accuracy in recognizing names and faces 3 decades later. This recognition memory, by the way, it did go down over time. So around 50 years, we're getting a little worse at name recognition and quite a bit worse at face recognition. But clearly memories don't disappear entirely after 50 years, or we wouldn't have any of that, right? Meanwhile, you probably remember that recognition memory in general is just an easier task than free recall kind of memory. So when they tested people on free recall, the numbers were lower even after 15 years and pretty darn low after 30 years. But again, some information is clearly able to be retained that long. We don't seem to have an upper cap on our duration of long-term memory. So long-term memory, it's virtually unlimited in size and duration, but clearly it also isn't perfect. Sometimes we can remember information and sometimes we can't. So what determines whether we remember? And to start answering that question, we're going to do a little demonstration. So I want you to grab a pen and paper. Go ahead and pause the video if you need to run and go get it. All right, we're going to do a free recall task. Just as a reminder, free recall means we'll present a bunch of stimuli and then the subject has to recall them back, but in any order. So for each item, it's going to be scored correct if you got the item on the list, regardless of its position. So this is different than serial recall, where we only count it as correct if it's in the right place. In this case, we're doing free recall. So I'll present a list of just random unrelated words. We're just going to see a list of words one at a time pop up on the screen. Afterward, you'll see a recall signal, just a bunch of asterisks, and it'll tell you, okay, time to recall, and you'll just write down as many words as you can remember from the list. Don't worry about the order, okay? Are you ready? Here we go. Okay, recall. Just write down whatever you can remember. All right, if you're still writing, pause the video and finish. So pause if you need to finish writing. Otherwise, I'm going to move on. Here are the words just so you can check how you did. Now, don't worry about your total score for this one. I'm not as worried about how many you remembered. Instead, I want you to look at the pattern of which words you remembered. Did the ones you got on your list tend to come from the start of this list, from the middle of this list, or from the end of this list? Now, when doing this with a bunch of participants, if I look at performance across a bunch of people, it's really common for people to get pupil and staff, the ones from the end of the list, and also roll and lake from the beginning of the list, but those middle words, not so much. Obviously, don't overinterpret your own results, whatever you got, because how a person does has some randomness to it on each trial. But imagine we ran hundreds of people through this demo and kind of tally up how many people remembered each of the words on the list in different positions. And of course, we could counterbalance in case it's something about the particular words. We could randomize or counterbalance the order of the words on these lists across a bunch of people and kind of still look for the average effect of early versus middle versus late position. And that's what a researcher named Murdoch did back in the 60s, just using a bunch of different lists of words, and here's what he found. Now, there's a lot going on in this graph, so let's just start with the axes. On the y-axis on the left, what are we measuring? Probability of recall. So basically, if we did this test with a ton of people, we're measuring how many people remember that word, one that's at the very start of the list or later in the list or whatever. So if we go down to the x-axis on the bottom where it says serial position, that just means we're asking about where the word was on the list. So the first word in any list would be position 1, the second word position 2, the 10th word position 10, and so on. Now, the graph looks kind of crazy here because it's actually showing a bunch of different experiments using lists of different length, like just 10 words on a list or 15 words or all the way up to a list of 40 words you have to try and recall at the end. So let's look at just the leftmost line of black filled circles, the shortest line here. For a 10-item list, almost everyone gets the 10th and final item, nearly 100% probability of recall. In fact, those last few items are fairly likely to be recalled, as is the first item or two, but then the middle of the list has the lowest odds. Now let's move on to the next condition, the next experiment, the open circles for a list of 15 words. And what do you know? We get the same pattern. Good chances of remembering those last few items, and pretty good chance for the first couple items, but not so much in the middle. And the same pattern holds across all the list lengths. Even for the list of 40 words, that's the open triangles here, you see that the longest line, the one going all the way to the right, you see that overall it's harder, right? Performance is lower for that line, and that's just because there's more items, and of course more time has passed, but even so, the first couple of items have a much higher chance of being recalled, and the last items have the best chance of all. So when Murdoch saw this overall pattern and how consistent it was for all sorts of lists of all different length, he called this curve that we keep seeing over and over, he called it the serial position curve. Items near the start, and especially items near the end of a list, just seem to be more likely to be recalled. Now you see this same serial position curve, the same curve pattern, regardless of how many items were in the list. It always has a bump in recall for the early items and a huge bump in recall for late items. We call that early bump on the left there the primacy effect. So items presented toward the start are more likely to be recalled. And we call that big spike at the end on the right side of the graph the recency effect. Items presented toward the end are more likely to be recalled. The recent ones are easy to remember, basically. Now the real question is, why does this happen? Why is it so consistent? What makes these two bumps happen? So you might actually pause the video for a minute or two and brainstorm some hypotheses. Well, one way we might investigate this is just thinking back to that modal model we've talked about. When it comes to long-term memory, something must determine what information goes from short-term memory into long-term memory. So one possibility is that a control process like rehearsal is at work. If you know you're doing a memory task, right? You're sitting down in a study and someone says, we're going to show you a list of words, you'll be tested on them later. Then on that first item, you're probably going to rehearse it to yourself while you wait for the second item. Then you're rehearsing those two items, and then after the third item, you're rehearsing those first three, and so on. But at some point, the new items come too fast for you to rehearse all of them, or just the whole thing goes beyond your word span limit. But regardless, you will have gotten the most rehearsals out of those first few words, right? So maybe that could explain the primacy effect. Now let's see if that hypothesis holds up. So our hypothesis is that the primacy effect is due to the fact that the first few items get more rehearsals than the other items, kind of like they got more rehearsals before being bumped out of the buffer, so to speak. And we're proposing that more rehearsal leads to better transfer to long-term memory. In other words, that rehearsal is a process of getting things into long-term memory. That would explain the primacy effect. And this idea was tested directly by Dewey-Rundis back in 1971. So he was testing to see if rehearsal predicts likelihood of later recall. So subjects in his study were given a free recall test after some words, and they were told to rehearse aloud. So during the test, when the words were coming up, they were told to rehearse the words out loud. That meant that Rundis, the experimenter, could kind of record this, could count the frequency with which each of the individual items in the list had been rehearsed, like just counting how many times each of the words had been said out loud by the participant, allowing us to test whether more rehearsals does actually lead to better recall. And here's his data. Items that were rehearsed 12 times on average had 84% chance of being remembered. If they were rehearsed at 9 times, then we're getting about 68% chance. If it's 6 times that they said it out loud, that's about 55% chance of remembering it. And if they only did 3 rehearsals, that meant a mere 40% chance of remembering the word. So it does appear that more rehearsals leads to better transfer into long-term memory. And that's nice, but we've still got an issue. Like, this accounts for the primacy effect perfectly. The left half of the graph, that's exactly what we would expect, with a curve going kind of downward as time goes on because we have less chance to rehearse those later words. But then we got that crazy recency effect on the right side of the graph. Notice that those items are recalled really, really well, but they actually get very few rehearsals. Like the triangle line here, that's the number of rehearsals. The triangle line on our graph here, number of rehearsals, and those last few items got very few, like 3 or fewer rehearsals, but they're remembered really well. So we need something else to explain the recency effect. And once again, we might go back to our modal model. We've got a spike in recall for the latest items, and indeed near perfect recall for that final item. So let's put ourselves in the shoes of a participant. Like, we're just doing this word recall task. You just saw the very last item, and then they told you, okay, write the words down. Well, obviously the most recent item is still going to be in your working memory, right? In fact, those last few items will probably still be in your working memory since they're the most recent thing on your mind and, they just got through your phonological loop. So that might be why we remember the recent items super well. They might not actually be in long-term memory at all, and we're just seeing some working memory, some shorter-term storage that we're pulling those few words out of. So that is a hypothesis for the other half of the serial position curve, that the recency effect is due to the fact that items presented at the end of the list are still in short-term memory or working memory at the time of recall. That would lead to near perfect recall of these items, which is basically what we see. And that also leads to a prediction. So if that's true, then we might expect those last few items from the list, the ones that are presumably still in working memory, those should be the ones first recalled by participants, since those are the words that are currently in their mind, right? So those are the ones they should be writing down first if this is true. Think of it kind of like this. Imagine the word list we gave someone was dog, pillow, shoe, map, cup, horse, train. We might draw it out kind of like this. So short-term or working memory, that's there on the left box, and long-term memory is a much bigger box on the right. Since dog, pillow, and shoe came early on, right there at the start of the list, the first words that were heard, then they got rehearsed quite a bit, right? And thus they got transferred at least somewhat into long-term memory. Meanwhile, the most recent words, at the end of the list, like cup, horse, and train, they just showed up for the participant. So there's not been much time to rehearse those or memorize those to get them into long-term memory. They're still there in the left box. So this hypothesis we're talking about, that suggests then that the words in the left box, those are going to be the ones the participant still has in their mind actively, so they'll report those first. We'll sort of empty out our working memory before we try and retrieve information back into working memory from long-term memory, right? Because it can only hold so much. We don't want to pull dog, pillow, and shoe back in until we've emptied out the things that are already in working memory. So if you look back to that demonstration we started with in this very video, did you keep track of which items you wrote down first? Like when you were writing down words that you remembered, did you kind of write it in order? If so, there's a decent chance, if you look at the ones you wrote first, that you probably wrote pupil or staff as one of those first few words, right? The ones that come at the end of the list are probably the ones, most likely, that you wrote early on, maybe even first, when you were just writing, in whatever order you wanted, the words that you remembered from that list. And indeed, when we test this, even if it doesn't hold for you individually, when we test this in the lab across lots of participants, here's what the data looks like. So this is just the probability of the item in each position being the first one that someone recalls, the first one that they write down. And in this case, it's for a test we did with a list of 12 items, but we see the same thing regardless of the list size. You can see here that the final item, in this case the 12th one, is almost always the first item recalled. But if not, then it's going to be one of those last handful usually, the ones that would still be in working memory. So this data at least fits with the hypothesis we proposed. It's one possible explanation that seems to work, but we should of course test it further before we settle on this one explanation, right? So let's see if we can falsify our hypothesis. We think items being in working memory is causing the recency spike. So if that's true, then if we flush out working memory before letting them do the recall, flush out their working memory before we tell them to start writing down words, that should abolish our recency effect, right? In other words, what happens if we empty the buffer, so to speak, before we allow them to recall? If our idea is right, that should get rid of the recency effect. And Glanzer and Kunitz actually tested this, and their way of testing is pretty straightforward. In one condition, they did the normal thing. They used immediate free recall, just meaning, the cue to recall the items was immediately after the presentation of the words. So that's what we had just been seeing in previous ones here. So you get word, and then there's a recall, and you write it down, okay? But then they had a second condition that they instead called delayed free recall. So in this case, subjects recall the items after a delay, and in that delay, they filled it with some distracting math activity. So they're kind of using their working memory for something else for a little bit, meaning it can't be holding those last few items from the list. So we flushed out working memory by using it for something else. So in the diagram, the immediate free recall, their first condition, that's what we saw before, right? Those last few items are still in working memory, so they're most likely to get pulled out and written down first. But the delayed free recall, it empties that left box before asking them to report on the words that they remember. So here is what they found. Now up top here, this is just our usual serial position curve. This is our hypotheses basically that we've labeled here for why we find a primacy effect and a recency effect. The primacy effect we think is due to some long-term memory stuff, basically more rehearsal, makes it more likely to get into long-term memory. And then the recency effect we're proposing is due to short-term memory or working memory effects, right? And then here in the middle, we've got their data from the two conditions. So the solid black line, where it says without intervening arithmetic, that's the usual setup. That's the immediate free recall condition, the one where we did not flush their short-term memory at all. So they could just pull this stuff right out of short-term or working memory. The dotted line on this graph, though, that's their second condition, the delayed free recall condition, where they did have participants do math before reporting on the words. And sure enough, just like we'd expect, it totally abolishes the recency effect. So that supports our hypothesis pretty strongly that the recency effect is using short-term memory, or what we call, now working memory. And by the way, just as a side note, some other data from the same time, if you present the words slower, like 2 seconds between words instead of 1 second between each word as you're going through the words on the list, then we get a graph that looks like this at the bottom. It's still a normal serial position curve, but notice the 2-second presentation is just higher overall. Like we do better overall. That's because slower presentation gives more time for us to rehearse. So items get into long-term memory better because they're getting more rehearsals. It doesn't make as much difference at the very end there, since that's determined by working memory stuff. But for the rest of the graph, it makes all the other items just a little more probable to be recalled, meaning even more support for our explanations here of the serial position effects. So now we can be pretty confident in those explanations. But let's try one last thing just to make sure we've got this right. Our idea is that recent items are so good because they're still in working memory, right? But that means they don't get as many rehearsals. And thus, we would expect that those last few items don't get transferred into long-term memory very well. So what happens if we test recall much later when only long-term memory is relevant? And that's what a researcher named Craik did. So it was the usual immediate free recall setup. So he did the thing, show the word, show the word, show the word, show the word. Okay, recall. He did that. But they added something else. He added having them do this long, unrelated activity for a while. So everything's clearly going to be gone from working memory. And then we come back later and say, okay, now how many can you remember from before? And that, all that's left now is going to be long-term memory. So after that long delay has gone by, we ask them a second time to go back and recall the words. So in our little diagram of what happened before that I drew, the subject basically got dog, pillow, shoe, and so on. And they were saying to themselves at the very start of the experiment, when dog showed up, they were probably saying to themselves, dog, 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 dog. And then dog, pillow, dog, pillow, dog, pillow. And then when the third one shows up, now they're saying dog, pillow, shoe, dog, pillow, shoe, dog, pillow, shoe, right? And then dog, pillow, shoe, map, and so on, until they start losing some of those items or not having enough time to repeat many of the words. But notice they're going to have very little chance to repeat cup, horse, or train, the things at the very end, before they're told to recall at the end, right? At which point, what are they going to do at the end? They're just going to write down train, horse, cup, maybe dog, whatever, maybe some of the others. But when they reported cup, horse, and train, they're basically just dumping out their working memory, right? Meaning those ones never went through the full process to encode them into long-term memory, right? They didn't get very much rehearsal. So that's what we think is happening. And indeed, Craik found evidence that that's exactly true. So look at the filled in line here, the one with the filled in bits, the darker. That is the immediate free recall, where they reported right after seeing the list. So that's our normal serial position curve, just what we would expect. That's normal. We've replicated the earlier results. Then they did something else for a long time, and later we had them come back for a final recall, which is the other line here, the open boxes. So this is their second test on the same set of words, but now it's just their long-term memory. And in that case, not only is the recency effect abolished, there's no recency effect, but now we actually get negative recency, doing the worst on the most recent items when we're only relying on long-term memory, which is exactly what we might expect based on our hypotheses we've been talking about, that the recency effect is solely due to those late items still being in working memory. So if we're no longer able to use that, then they're actually going to be the worst because they never got into long-term memory. They didn't get the rehearsal process. By the way, you might wonder, does this whole serial position curve mean we'll never be able to remember items from the middle of a list? And while serial position curve is really well established at this point, there are, of course, other effects that might help certain items. Even those in the middle of the list, we can still get them into long-term memory through other processes, right? I don't know, if we were doing a bunch of random boring words on our list, but halfway through, right in the middle, we put in a really racy word or a super offensive word, that emotional activation might be enough to get it into long-term memory, even if it's in a middle serial position. And indeed, people started looking at exceptions or additions to the serial position curve all the way back in the 70s. Like this one. I might ask you to name as many US presidents as you can remember. There have been quite a few. You could pause and actually give this a shot yourself if you want. You could try it as free recall, see how many you can get total, or even serial recall, see how many you can get in the correct position. So if you want to try that out, pause and try before I show you. Here's the data from a 1976 study. So they asked people to recall the presidents all the way back in 1976. So this only goes up to the 70s. Don't look for recent presidents here. But the dotted line that we see here, that's free recall. The solid line here, that's serial recall, where position does matter. You have to get it in the right order. So you can basically see, everyone gets Washington at the start, or almost everyone. And Adams and Jefferson are likely to be remembered, although the order might start to trip people up a little bit. And on the far right end, remember, this is done in the 70s. So that's Ford, Nixon, Johnson, Kennedy there at the end, which these people got those pretty well since those are the ones they'd been alive for at the time. But then you get some occasional bumps in the middle of the list, like Teddy Roosevelt here or Abraham Lincoln in spot 16. So Obviously, there's got to be more to our memory than just serial position. That can't be the only explanation or the only factor. And we'll see there are many factors other than rehearsal that probably affect our probability of recalling things later, especially when we get into more real-world tasks that aren't just memorizing lists of words. So in the next video, we're going to talk about some general effects, a lot of effects that determine how we get things into long-term memory successfully and how we get them back out of long-term memory successfully. In other words, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of encoding and retrieval processes, and we'll also see some really good tips for things like studying effectively. And we'll see that it comes down to a lot more than just rehearsal.